October 24, 1961. Lincoln, Massachusetts. A quiet town. The kind of place where people left doors unlocked and mornings moved slow. A young mother, 31 years old, is home with her 2 children while her husband is away on business. By late afternoon, a neighbor would find the kitchen smeared with blood, the phone ripped from the wall, a phone book opened to emergency numbers, a trail of blood leading out to the driveway, and no sign of the woman who belonged in that house. Her 4-year-old daughter would say something that stuck with everyone who heard it. "Mommy is gone, and the kitchen is covered with red paint." That girl was describing blood, but she used the word paint because that is what a child reaches for when reality is too big to name. This is still unanswered. I'm Claire Donnelly. Michael, welcome back to the show. I'm grateful you're here to walk through this one with me. It's been haunting New England for decades.
Thanks, Claire. It's good to be here. Joan Risch's disappearance is one of those cases that kind of lives in the gray zone. Enough physical detail to make you feel like something happened, but not enough to let you finish the story. That ambiguity is painful, and it's what keeps people thinking about it.
Exactly. Before we unpack the day itself, tell listeners briefly who Joan was. I feel like too often we start with the body of evidence and forget the person at the center.
Right. Joan Carolyn Bard, later Joan Risch, was born in Brooklyn in 1930. She had a complicated childhood. There's a report that she lost her parents in a house fire when she was a child and spent years living with relatives. She went to college, Wilson College, earned a degree in English, moved into publishing in New York, and worked her way up from secretary to editorial assistant. She married Martin Risch in the mid-1950s, had 2 children, Lillian, born around 1957, and David, born in 1959, and by April 1961, the family had moved to Lincoln, Massachusetts. So this was a woman who'd had a professional life, who read widely, who wasn't a stereotype of any simple era.
And Lincoln, at that time, semi-rural, quietly affluent. It wasn't a place where you expected violent crimes to happen in daylight. Neighbors remembered Joan as pleasant, competent, a woman raising her children and getting involved in local life. So why does this feel so dissonant? A life with roots, and then the kitchen scene.
That's the core of the dissonance. When an apparently stable life has an eruption like this, investigators and neighbors scramble to reconcile the 2 images. Which image is the real Joan? The woman who worked in New York, who moved to Lincoln by choice, or the figure who vanished from a bloody kitchen? The answer, of course, may be neither and both. But let's walk through the day. I think detail matters here.
Please, walk us through October 24th, as precisely as we can.
Morning starts normal. Martin Risch leaves early for a business trip to New York. Joan is home with Lillian and David. She does ordinary things, dresses the kids, probably some housekeeping, errands. Around midday, she interacts with neighbors. There are accounts of a delivery mid-morning and brief neighborly visits. The crucial stretch begins around 2 in the afternoon.
Right. She took the children over to the Barker family across the street, didn't she? That image keeps coming back to me. A neighbor saying, "I'll watch them for a bit." It's almost like Joan made sure the children were out of the way.
Around 2 to 2:15, Joan brings Lillian and David to Barbara Barker's house. She tells Barbara she'll be back soon. Lillian and Barbara's son play on a swing set in the yard, which famously doesn't have a view of the Risch home. At about 2:15 p.m., Barbara looks out and sees Joan in her driveway, wearing a trench coat and carrying something red in her arms. That is the last confirmed sighting by someone who knew her. Then, roughly 2 hours later, Lillian is sent back across the street and returns saying, in child terms, that Mommy is gone and the kitchen is covered with red paint.
The image of a trench coat and something red, it's cinematic, almost. Barbara's last sighting becomes the last human anchor of the timeline. But then the scene Barbara sees inside the house, the kitchen, is why this case becomes, frankly, one of the most photographed missing person mysteries of mid-20th century America.
When Barbara goes into the house, she finds David upstairs in his crib, unharmed, frightened. In the kitchen, extensive smears and pools of blood on the floor and walls, an overturned or pushed table, a phone ripped from the wall with the handset thrown in the trash can, and a phone book open to emergency numbers. There's a trail of blood leading out of the kitchen, through the house, and into the driveway where it abruptly stops. Lane of questions from that tableau.
Let's pause at that phone detail for a second. The handset in the trash, the phone ripped out. To me, that suggests someone didn't want a call to be made. It looks violent, like an assailant physically removed the phone. But are there other interpretations?
There are. On the surface, ripping a phone from the wall appears to be an act of aggression, an assailant preventing a call for help. But investigators and later analysts have also entertained the idea that it might have been staged. Someone trying to create the appearance of a violent attack, or alternately, someone panicking and tearing the phone loose themselves. Technology and forensics in 1961 couldn't always say with confidence which was more likely. So that single detail ends up supporting different narratives depending on your assumptions.
That's the maddening thing about this case. Almost every piece of evidence admits of two stories. The blood is either proof of grievous harm or evidence of a self-inflicted, non-lethal wound used to create a dramatic exit. The phone is either evidence of a violent interruption or a prop in a staged scene. Let's talk about the blood itself.
Investigators at the time tested the blood and found it to be type O, which matched Joan's blood type. Remember, this is 1961. DNA wasn't an option. They could place the blood to a type, but not an individual. Observers describe the volume as substantial, but modern commentary sometimes argues it wasn't clearly fatal. The patterns were also mixed. There were drips and smears, suggesting someone moving while bleeding, and there were attempts at wiping, which could mean someone tried to clean up or staunch the flow.
And the trail of blood led to the driveway and just stopped there. No body, no clear vehicle trace, no obvious drag marks. So either something happened beyond the driveway, a car pulled up, someone carried a body, or whatever happened ended right there. It's a maddeningly small puzzle.
There were witness reports that afternoon of a disoriented woman, possibly injured, walking alongside local roads and near Route 128, which at the time was under construction, a landscape of disturbed ground and machinery. Witnesses described a woman who looked disheveled, possibly clutching her abdomen. But none of the witnesses could later make a positive, ironclad identification. So we have a plausible sighting trail, but no continuity.
I want to dive into those sightings because they open up a set of possibilities. Michael, was there any hospital evidence? Anyone showing up at an ER with a wound?
Hospitals in the region were contacted, and none reported treating a woman who matched Joan's description for severe bleeding that day. That doesn't rule out everything. It's possible she collapsed somewhere remote and died, or was picked up and taken elsewhere. It also leaves open misidentification. In 1961, people would have seen a lot of women in coats, and some witnesses may have been seeing something else entirely. But put all these sightings together, and you get a haunting, if inconclusive, picture of someone moving through the landscape wounded and confused.
Let's talk about the investigation itself. The police on scene initially, Sergeant Mike McHugh and Chief Leo Algeo, treated it with the gravity you'd expect, but the tools just weren't what we have now. For listeners, could you explain how forensic limitations of the era shaped the conclusions, or the lack of them?
Absolutely. In 1961, investigators had blood typing, basic fingerprinting, and a hatful of good instincts. They didn't have DNA. There was very little in the way of blood-stain pattern analysis as a standardized, court-accepted science. Forensic labs were slower, and the ability to cross-reference fingerprints wasn't nearly as powerful. That means physical traces like smears, footprints, or subtle DNA on a phone cord would be all but useless. So a scene that today might reveal a signature, the way someone moved, the angle of a wound, traces of another person's DNA, in 1961 left much more room for narrative interpretation.
Which is why some investigators later said they were unsure whether the scene was staged or genuine. You can't overstate how important that uncertainty is. It's one thing to have an unsolved disappearance. It's another to have a scene that seems to point in contradictory directions. That friction fuels theories.
Right, and for the record, police did check the husband, Martin. He was in New York on business. He had a verifiable alibi and was not charged. He, in fact, spent years pushing for answers and keeping the case alive. That sustained effort is, to me, consistent with someone who had no part in what happened. But of course, it's not dispositive.
Let's take a breath. We're entering territory where speculation can easily become indictment, and we have to be careful here. There are a handful of theories that circulate. Violent abduction by a stranger, Joan staging her own disappearance, a botched illegal medical procedure, an accidental killing and cover-up, or a psychological fugue. I'd like to run through each one with you, Michael. Lay out the supporting points and the holes. Can we start with the stranger abduction or murder?
Sure. Theory 1, stranger attack. The kitchen's disarray, the ripped phone, the blood, and the witnesses describing a disoriented, bleeding woman all support the idea of a violent intruder. If someone broke in or entered under false pretenses and attacked Joan, they could have left with her or, in their confusion and haste, disposed of her body somewhere. A waiting car would explain the abrupt end of the blood trail in the driveway.
What about the counterpoints?
No forced entry was clearly documented. There's no neighbor who heard sustained screams. No suspect vehicle was ever positively identified. And crucially, despite massive searches around Route 128 and the surrounding woods, no body was ever found. That's not proof it didn't happen, but it weakens the case for a raw stranger abduction turned homicide that left quick physical evidence behind.
Okay, Theory 2, the staged disappearance. This is the one that has captured a lot of imaginations, partly because of the library books Joan had checked out. Can you summarize that angle?
About a year into the investigation, it's reported that Joan had checked out several crime and mystery novels, including some by a writer published under the name Harry Carmichael, a pen name for Leo Ognall. Some of these books deal with women who vanish or with staged scenes. Leo Ognall later wrote fiction inspired by the case, suggesting a woman might have killed a visitor in self-defense and then staged her disappearance. People point to the open phone book, the ripped phone, and the idea that Joan took her children across the street as signs she might have planned this. The argument goes, she intentionally created a theatrical scene to convince authorities she had been attacked and then left to start a new life.
And the holes in that theory?
There are many. To stage a convincing attack using self-inflicted wounds is highly risky. You can bleed to death. She left behind 2 young children, and there is no solid trail of someone living under a new identity. No money transfers, no sightings that can be verified decades later, nothing concrete. Plus, Joan had been a publishing professional. Yes, she read mysteries, but that's not necessarily a red flag. Lots of people check out mystery novels. The theory says more about the human taste for tidy narratives than it does about reliable evidence.
That's a point I want to underscore for listeners: confirmation bias. Once you start thinking someone staged their disappearance, you reframe everything you see to fit that story. A phone ripped from a wall becomes an intentional prop rather than the act of an attacker. Library books become a manual. We have to hold both ideas, staging and real violence, in one hand at the same time, and be honest about what is actually supported.
Exactly. Let's move to the third set of theories, which cluster around the idea of an accident or a medical procedure gone wrong, the abortion theory that sometimes surfaces in conversation.
This one is delicate, and we should tread carefully. What does the evidence say about the possibility that Joan had a medical emergency at home, perhaps an illegal abortion procedure, and that part of the scene is the result of panic and cover-up?
Speculatively, in 1961, illegal abortions were a clandestine reality. A botched procedure could cause internal hemorrhage, bleeding into the torso. And there's a line of thought that someone may have been trying to help Joan, panicked, tore the phone off the wall to stop her calling and identifying them, and then removed her in a car. This could account for a bloody kitchen and a vanished woman. But the single glaring problem is that there is no evidence Joan was pregnant. Nothing in the public record indicates she was seeking an abortion. So this theory fills gaps with period context rather than case-specific proof.
And often, this theory is used as a kind of shorthand for unexplained medical calamity. I think it's important to note that without a medical record or a confirmed witness linking Joan to such an event, we're mostly speculating from the 1960s cultural context, which is useful context but not the same as evidence.
Yes. The fourth major theory is that of a domestic accident or a killing during a confrontation with someone Joan knew, the so-called self-defense killing scenario. This is the story Leo Ognall fictionalized. A visitor comes, an argument escalates, Joan defends herself, and then what's left is either a staged scene or a panicked departure. Supporters of that idea point to the kitchen's domestic setting and the possibility of an acquaintance being present without the household being alarmed.
Again, what's the problem with that theory?
No body of a victim was reported, no weapon was found, no visitor was linked to Joan that day, and police never turned up evidence of an acquaintance having been in the house. And because it's a kind of neat fictional construct, meet someone, conflict, accident, cover-up, it plays very well as a novel or short story, which is perhaps why fiction writers latched onto it.
Finally, the psychological break, or dissociative fugue. There's some mention in records of Joan's childhood trauma, losing parents in a fire, and the idea that perhaps she had an episode, left in a fugue-like state, and wandered off. Can that square with the blood evidence?
A dissociative fugue is possible in very rare circumstances and can lead people to travel away, sometimes under a new identity. However, the staged cues, phone ripped out, phone book open to emergency numbers, look purposeful, and there's the question of serious blood loss. Self-inflicted bleeding combined with fugue is an odd combination. It requires us to imagine a woman injuring herself enough to create a dramatic scene and then walking away with little to no plan. It's not impossible, but it requires multiple speculative steps. And again, no later identity emerges that can be tied back to Joan.
So each theory has some evidence and major problems. That duality, the two faces of the evidence, is why the case persists. For listeners who like a more concrete sense of how investigators worked this, can you walk us through searches and specific leads that were promising but went cold?
After the discovery, police mounted searches of local woods, fields, and the Route 128 construction area. Volunteers and canine teams were used. Witnesses who reported seeing a bloody woman were interviewed, and hospitals were queried. The dirty blue and white car reported in the neighborhood before the disappearance was investigated but never tied to a suspect. Officers followed up on leads across state lines, and the case stayed active for many years, but without physical corroboration, no body, no definitive DNA, no car tied to the scene, leads fizzled. That pattern, promising tip, exhaustive local inquiry, nothing conclusive, is brutal for families and investigators alike.
Let's talk about the aftermath. Martin raised the children, stayed engaged with the case, and the household, the two children, had to grow up without their mother. How does a community process something like this?
Lincoln carried a long memory. It's the kind of case that becomes local folklore. People who lived through it remember the search parties, the atmosphere of fear and curiosity. For the family, unresolved disappearances create an open wound that can influence life choices and relationships for decades. Martin's continued involvement shows that he never received closure. That there was never a named suspect or a body meant the family couldn't attend a funeral, couldn't have a legal resolution many families rely on. That uncertainty is a heavy psychological load.
There was also the cultural framing. Joan as a housewife who might have resented suburban life. Joan as a victim. Joan as someone who staged her disappearance. Those narratives tell you as much about the storytellers as they do about Joan. Michael, after spending years studying cases like this, are there investigative techniques or modern tools that might have changed the outcome had they existed in 1961?
Definitely. DNA testing could have identified blood or traces from another person. Modern blood stain pattern analysis might better clarify the dynamics of the kitchen scene. Surveillance cameras, not relevant in most homes then, but today ubiquitous, would have tracked movement in and out of the driveway. And digital financial traces, credit cards, cell phones, social media, simply didn't exist. Those modern artifacts frequently help resolve disappearances. But it's worth noting that not every cold case is destined to be solved with modern forensics. Human factors, witnesses' memories, the presence of a body, cooperation from potential witnesses still matter hugely.
And in this case, the presence of no body remains critical. Without remains, there's an entire class of evidence that's forever missing. One of the more intriguing details to the public has been the library records and the books Joan checked out. Let's return to that for a minute. How much weight do you give that?
Books tell us about interests and certainly provide material for imagination. Joan, working in publishing and reading crime novels, is not suspicious in itself. The problem is when curiosity becomes evidence in the minds of investigators or the public. She read books about vanishings, therefore she planned one. That's a leap. If she had bought supplies, reserved a vehicle, transferred money, or made contact with someone prepared to help her disappear, that would be more compelling. As it stands, library records are a suggestive detail at best.
And then there's Leo Ognall, a writer who fictionalized the case and believed Joan had killed a man and run. Fiction can reshape real cases in the public mind, can't it?
It absolutely can. Writers like Ognall are artists and will take the most novelistic strands of a story and weave a narrative that reads well. Readers then sometimes conflate the fiction with investigative reality. From the historian's perspective, Ognall's book and correspondence reflect a particular interpretation, but not evidence. It matters culturally because it keeps the case in the public imagination and frames Joan in a specific light, as someone harboring a terrible secret. But we should keep that distinct from investigative fact.
Let's pause for a human moment. Lillian, Joan's daughter, calling the red paint, that detail is so heartbreaking. Children frame trauma in the terms they have. That line has been repeated in news reports for decades, and it sticks to the case like a scar.
Yes, that child's perception is both heartbreaking and important because it anchors the chaos to a human center. People sometimes forget that we're not just talking about clues and theories. We're talking about a mother whose place in her children's lives was abruptly vacated. For the children, the uncertainty becomes a story they carry. That line, red paint, keeps listeners tethered to the human cost.
I want to ask you something a little broader, Michael. Why do cases like this persist in the public imagination? What do they reveal about the way we try to make sense of suffering and ambiguity?
Cases like Joan's persist because they remain narratively unresolved. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We crave closure. When presented with a half-formed narrative, our brains tend to fill in the gaps with the most emotionally satisfying possibility, either the drama of a villain's capture or the romance of a woman's reinvention. There's also an ethical angle. Unsolved disappearances remind us of failures of institutions, police limitations, social stigma, cultural blind spots, and so they persist as reminders and cautionary tales. Finally, there's a social hunger for stories that are both mysterious and human. Joan's case has both.
Do you worry, as a historian and criminologist, about the ethics of true crime? We consume these stories, sometimes turning real suffering into entertainment. How should listeners think about that while staying curious?
I think being reflective is key. Curiosity is natural and often constructive. Cases get solved because people keep paying attention. But listeners should remember the human subjects, victims, families, first responders. Try to avoid reducing people to puzzle pieces. Also, treat speculative theories with a kind of respectful skepticism. Enjoy the intellectual exercise, but recognize where the evidence ends. And consider that public attention can sometimes reopen wounds for families, so empathy matters.
Well said. Before we move to closing, let's run through the tangible things that remain. Joan is still listed as endangered missing in databases like the Doe Network. No one has been charged, no body, no definitive sightings that can be corroborated. Is there anything else in the public record that might be worth investigators revisiting today?
It would be useful, where possible, to re-examine physical items if any survive. Clothing, objects collected at the scene, any preserved swatches of the bloodied material. If anything is in a state suitable for modern DNA testing, that could be productive. Also, re-interviewing surviving witnesses with modern interview techniques can sometimes unearth small details overlooked at the time. That said, after 6 decades, memories fade and records may be lost. But cold case units sometimes make progress precisely by marrying old leads with new technology and fresh eyes.
So hope is limited, but not zero. Michael, I want to end this segment by leaning into the human core we started with. 60-plus years on, Joan's children, adults now, still carry the absence. Martin carried the search. The town remembers the unsettled feeling. We close this episode without answers. But I want to ask you, as a historian, as someone who studies these human tragedies, what do you want listeners to take away?
3 things. 1. Hold complexity. Real life rarely gives us the clean narrative arcs we want. 2. Be mindful of the human beings behind the headlines. Joan wasn't an archetype. She was a mother, a professional, a person with a history. And 3. Skepticism matters. It's fine to theorize, but let's not mistake imagination for evidence. Cases like Joan's deserve curiosity tempered by compassion.
Thank you. For the next few minutes, I want to walk listeners back through the day in quiet detail, not to speculate, but to sit with the images. Picture a drizzly New England afternoon, maple leaves thin on the trees, Route 128, a chaos of construction off in the distance, a family crossing the street to a neighbor's in an ordinary suburban choreography, some women in coats, a basket of groceries, and then a child's voice saying red paint. It's simple and then impossible to hold.
Those images stay with you. They remind us that the deepest mysteries are rarely the grand ones. They're the domestic ones. A kitchen, a phone, children playing across the street. That's where history touches private life. And sometimes history leaves the story unfinished.
Before we close, a couple short notes. If you have any information about Joan Risch's disappearance, local authorities in Lincoln maintain the case, and national missing person databases have her file. And if you, as a listener, are tempted to spin a wild theory, remember the family's experience. Keep curiosity kind.
Amen to that. And to anyone out there interested in cold cases, study the facts, consult primary sources where possible, and avoid turning speculation into accusation.
In October 1961, a woman walked out of her kitchen, bleeding, into a New England afternoon. Maybe she was running from someone, maybe from her life, maybe from herself. We don't know where she went. We don't know if she ever stopped running. What we do know is that for the people she left behind, the trail went cold a long time ago, and more than 60 years later, the case of Joan Risch is still unanswered. Thank you, Michael, for your thoughtful company today.
Thank you, Claire. It's been a privilege to look at this story with you.
If you enjoyed this episode of Still Unanswered, please consider subscribing and sharing. We try to treat these stories with care. I'm Claire Donnelly. Take care of each other.